Hello and welcome to Be Read, where authors translate Brazil. Today we're going to speak to economist Alysson Portella, discussing his new book, Numbers of Racial Discrimination, Human Development, Equity and Public Policies, which he co-organized with fellow economist Michael França. The book, for which they authored several chapters, recently won the prestigious academic Jabuti Award in the economy category. It's a deep dive into the evolution of racial inequality in Brazil, examining areas like income, education, health, violence, and political representation. The data they present leaves no doubt that Brazil continues to grapple with a deeply racist social system. Alongside the stark numbers, the book also offers clear diagnosis and potential solutions for building a fair society. Alysson, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Before we continue with the interview, here's a brief message from our deputy editor.
If you like To Be Read and other special series from the Explaining Brazil podcast, you should subscribe to the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We're a subscription-only website providing valuable insights on Brazil and Latin America. And check us out on YouTube and social media to keep up with all the latest news. If you already subscribe, you can also support us at buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report, where you can become a member in exchange for exclusive content and a shout out on this podcast. So without further ado, a special thank you goes to Cristina Viu, Andrei Novoseltsev, Wild Rice, Jaciara de Oliveira, Carson Allen, Gabriel Luca, Pan Ludwig, Leslie Seal, Mark Hillary, Louise Renz, Erwan Menais, Aaron Berger, Kars Vriesvik, Astor Townsend, Mila Renacido, Peter Abramson, David Dixon, Jose Ozi Stankovic, Emerging Market Muser, Anna Lund, Peter Suffren, Anderson da Silva, and someone who chose to remain anonymous. Back to the show.
So, Alysson, before we dive into the book, as we are two white individuals discussing racial discrimination in Brazil, I think it's important to start by talking about your partnership with Michael França, who couldn't join us today. So what led you to specialize in racial issues within the field of economics, and what inspired the two of you to collaborate on this book?
Perfect. So my interest in the subject started when I was doing my master's in economics. So during my master's, I was doing research on the quality of education in Brazil. And during this period, we discussed it a lot among classmates on topics such as racial inequality. So affirmative action policies in Brazil to reserve seats for Black students in public universities was passed by 2012. So it was a very hot topic when I was doing my master's. But I never liked a lot the way it was discussed, because it was much more focused on the rights of those that were displaced by these policies, instead of focusing on what sort of public policies we have to do to reduce racial inequality in Brazil, which is I think is the most important question to be asking on racial inequality and on affirmative action policies. Mm-hmm. So because of these discussions, I decided that I wanted to study racial inequality in education in Brazil, trying to understand why Black kids study less or perform worse in standardized tests in Brazil. So what are the root causes of this problem? Then I started my PhD at INSPER. So I did my research on this subject and, of course, on other topics related to racial inequality. And this is when I met Michael França. It's a very funny story because I was doing my PhD at INSPER Michael was doing his PhD at University of São Paulo, and we took the same class in a third university with Professor Rodrigo Soares. We met there and we started talking about, so we had common interests. We also went to the same university for our period as visiting researchers at University of Columbia. So we became good friends, and after that, Michael went to INSPER as a postdoc researcher to work with the same professor that I was working with too. So he and Sergio Firpo started the Center of Racial Studies at INSPER. Mm-hmm. And soon after, he invited me to start collaborating on some research. And well, after that, I think it's just history. So I guess we just started like doing a lot of research, and it ended up in the book that you can see there.
Very fruitful collaboration. So yeah. When it comes to researching economic figures of racial discrimination, there are plenty of valuable studies from the US, for instance. But Brazil and other Latin American countries have an important difference, namely the fluidity of racial classification. Can you explain how this plays out here and what challenges and opportunities it presents to understanding and combating racial inequality?
Perfect. So yeah, most of the research in economics of racial inequality has been done in the US, and mostly by US researchers. And in the US, race is kind of more simple. It has been changing over the last decades, but traditionally we associated race with the one-drop rule in the US. So if you have any ancestor that was black, you are automatically black as well. So it depends more on descendancy than on physical appearance. And in Latin America, it's the opposite. So here in Brazil, for instance, what characterizes someone as black or white or mixed race, brown, it's the skin color mostly. And of course, the shape of the hair, the nose also play a role here, but mostly skin color. So it doesn't matter if your grandfather was black or your mother was white, it matters how you look. And this poses some interesting challenges because the way people understand race is much more fluid. So it will depend on the context, on your social position as well. So in the past, we had this saying that money whitens. So meaning that as you ascend in your social class, it may also influence how people and yourself perceive your skin color and your race. So rich people might be classified more likely as white than black, even if they have the same skin color as someone that is poor. Recently, this has been changing. Some researchers in sociology, mostly Edward Stellis, who is based in Princeton, if I'm not wrong. So he's a Brazilianist at Princeton, and he does a lot of research in Latin America. And he has some very interesting research onto how people see and classify themselves and others. And he shows, for instance, that the more educated you are more likely to classify as black instead of white. But the opposite happens with wealth. And in Brazil, we have been, now we have a new trend that in the last 2 decades, people have been classifying more or identified themselves more as black. So there's a whole social process taking place right now, and it's very interesting. Like the way people are understanding race in Brazil is kind of changing. People are now more proud of their black origins, and this is really interesting actually, and poses a lot of other research questions that, well, they are very challenging.
even a sense of unity, and even in combating racism, right?
Exactly. There was a whole stigma associated with blackness in the past. So people didn't want to be identified as black. So there was this process of whitening, as they say. So people wanted to become white, either themselves or their children or grandchildren. So they tried to marry with white people. But nowadays it's changing. So in part due to a lot of political pressure from the Black movement that has been quite successful since the 80s, and in part because of awareness of racism, which has been always denied in Brazil. So we have this idea of racial democracy that was quite popular in the 50s and the 60s, and in some corners of Brazil even today. So especially very far right-wing groups, they tend to deny racism in Brazil. So yeah, it's a process, but nowadays people are becoming more proud of their race.
That's interesting. Another significant aspect of Brazil's racial landscape relates to its history. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery and was the main destination for the Atlantic slave trade. We've touched on this in previous episodes, but could you give us an overview of how racial mobility has unfolded in Brazil since then? What factors have most hindered or supported this process in the 20th and 21st centuries?
Perfect. That's perfect. So Brazil was the last country, as you mentioned, to abolish slavery in the Americas. So it was very recent, actually, if you think about the historical process, like 130 years ago. And one bad thing about Brazil is that we don't have very good data on social mobility, especially in the past. So Brazil has been always been very unequal, even compared to the US, which is an unequal country when you compare with other developed countries. And we observe mostly data from the 80s on, 1980s on. So inequality was really, really high back then. It started to reduce mostly in the turn of the century, around the 20th, the 2000s. Racial inequality decreased by some degree, but it was mostly linked to the overall process of inequality reduction in Brazil that took place in that same period. So Brazil was a highly unequal country in the 80s. Inequality started to reduce in the late 90s and reduced a lot in the 2000 and 2010. And racial inequality decreased with it as well. But since 2010, it became flat again, this overall reduction in inequality, so it stagnated. And now we see that Black people receives around 30 to 40% less than the average white worker, for instance. So, and this process of social mobility in Brazil was always hampered by very low levels of education that we gave to basically all individuals in Brazil. So in the US, where you have very good data on social mobility, there is a very recent study that was published that they could trace back intergenerational mobility in the US since just after the Civil War. And they show how social mobility and intergenerational mobility was different for Black people back then, and it's still different. And this happens for several reasons. So for one is that, okay, Black people were poor in the past, and they are more likely to remain poor in the present. But this in part is because, there is a process of that inequality is perpetuated over generation. However, there is some other challenges that make it more difficult for Black people to ascend that are more related with, let's say, it's structural racism. So the state and governments, they invest much less in neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly Black. So, and this is related to residential segregation in the US, which was very strong in the past and continues to be. In the US, you had Jim Crow that forbid Black students to attend the same school as white students, and this made really difficult for Black children to study. And you have discrimination in the labor market and even in education. So similar workers, they are less likely to receive similar wages. So you compare workers with the same level of education that have similar jobs, that work in the same city, and Black people receive less. And this is related to discrimination. So these three factors, so economic factors, pure economic factors, as we say, institutional discrimination, which is lower investment from the state directed to Black communities, and discrimination itself, direct discrimination in the labor market. This make it much more difficult for Black people to prosper in the US and in Brazil. Of course, the way it plays in Brazil is a little bit different than in the US. So in the US, there was a lot of official and state-driven segregation, so Jim Crow, as I said. In Brazil, we never really have had that, so but we had it indirectly. So education was never a priority in Brazil, in public education for children, even more so. Brazil traditionally invested much more of their public funds in universities, in very good public universities that actually rich people used to attend and still attend. So this created a lot of privilege for rich people in Brazil, and this helped to perpetuate racial inequality as well.
Talking about this, the introductions of racial quotas in university during the 2000s and 2010s significantly pushed the fight against racial inequality into the public discourse. However, the book highlights a surprising fact. Despite the increase in education, the pay gap between white and Black workers in the job market has remained virtually unchanged since the 1980s at 13%. So beyond access to higher education, what public policies could Brazil have implemented to close this gap, but hasn't yet?
Yeah, that's a great question, because in Brazil, we tend to focus a lot on affirmative actions at public universities. They were really important, like, don't take me wrong. We have a whole chapter of our book about affirmative actions at universities. There's a lot of research showing that they were really important to increase access of not only Black students, but also poor white students to public universities. And they were really important. And they had very few negative effects on those displaced students, because they generally can find other alternatives to attend other private universities. And one of the reasons that progress was limited is precisely that. There was a lot of new private universities in Brazil. They were very few in the 90s, but they increased a lot in size and number of enrolled students. And nowadays, private universities comprise 75% of all enrollment in college in Brazil. And they are not covered by affirmative actions, at least the ones that we have now. Of course, we have other policies, such as ProUni, which is scholarships that the government pays to students. So the government pays the fees of these private universities for poor students. They benefit mostly Black students in Brazil. We have also some lines of financing and loans that we give to students, mostly poor students, that also benefit Black students. But we don't have explicit affirmative actions at private institutions in Brazil. So this is something that we have to deal with. Maybe we have to be more explicit about designing this financial incentives for private institutions. We have to say, okay, if you want to access loans from the government for your students, or if you want us to pay your fees, you have to have at least X% of your places reserved for Black students, especially in degrees that are very competitive in Brazil, such as medicine or law or architecture or whatever, or economics, for instance. So this is one policy directed to the area of education. But another challenge in Brazil is basic education. So we are doing some research right now showing that access to college is very correlated with access to high school, which is quite obvious. To go to college, you must finish high school. But in Brazil, a lot of people don't finish high school. They drop out. And you can guess which is the population that is most likely to drop out of high school. So we have to do a lot of work in this direction, and work and public policies to fix these issues. They have to start not at school. They have to start when these children are are in the belly of their mothers, because during the pregnancy, it's when the fetus starts to develop. The way you are born with, it helps to explain part of your performance in school. So you have to make sure that pregnant women are getting the best treatment possible. When children are born, we have to help families to raise them. So give books, teach families how to interact with their children, because all of this will play a role when children enter school. So in my thesis, for instance, I find that at the first year, there is a failure rate of 15% for white students in a Brazilian town. But for Black students, it's more than 30% that fail the first grade in basic education. So because they enter school already behind white children. And we must start to deal with policies at the labor market level. So this is something that the US did actually in the 60s. So there was an executive order in 1965 by President Lyndon Johnson, if I'm not wrong, that required those companies that supply the federal government to have a certain percentage of Black employees. It depended on the area that they acted in the state, because there is a lot of variation at the state level in the racial composition. But this policy was very successful in the US to increase the level of employment for Black individuals. So there is a recent study that showed that this policy increased in 0.8 percentage points the share of Black workers in firms, in establishments that were regulated by this executive order. And it seems to be not a very small number, actually, but if you think about the whole US economy, something between 1.3 and 0.8 percentage points would be enough to close the gap in employment. So if this policy were extended to the whole US economy, it would be very successful in closing racial gaps in employment in the US. So for certain, we have to start to think about some policies like that to put in place in Brazil. And of course, other campaigns. We have a lot of we don't know much actually about racial discrimination in the labor market in Brazil. We know that we can estimate that the gap in payment is around 13%. But we never did some correspondence studies, for instance, that try to measure how employers discriminate job candidates which are similar in all aspects but their race. So there's a lot of these studies in the US. In Brazil, we don't have any. We just have one that is very small scale. So we also have to do some more research to understand better. And this will help us to design some better policies. But for certain affirmative actions, for those that supply the Brazilian government, would be a very important policy now, and that had proven effects in the US.
For sure. And for the final question, Alysson, it's clear from the data that the notion of Brazil as a racial democracy, where white and black citizens exercise the same rights, was debunked long ago. What's the next myth we need to challenge when discussing racial inequalities in Brazil? Is gender, for instance, still misunderstood in this context?
Yeah, that's a great question. So gender for sure is something that we have to have policies to promote gender equality in Brazil. Again, in the US, we have a lot of studies on the subject. In Brazil, we have some, but we need more. So there is a lot of policies that we can design to improve the economic situation and the labor market conditions for women in Brazil. So we don't have any what's the name of this policy? When you give the license for the parents, for the father, not only the mother. So
to leave the job for a temporary.
Yeah, the job leaves after the children are born. In Brazil, it's just like it's 3 or 4 months for mothers, and parents have a few days. So we need to fix that for sure. And we also need some campaigns. We have to give also more access to birth control for women. This is really important because we know that a lot of the gender gap is associated with women have children, so they have to leave the market to work, and they have a hard time going back. But I would also add that an important myth in Brazil that we have to still debunk is the role of the state in promoting development in Brazil. So in the left and in the right, we tend to think that the government has to act to promote the firms and economic sectors, giving a lot of subsidies to firms and to some entrepreneurs. But when you think about it, we have to promote, the state should focus more in subsidizing and promote the development of individuals. So this has been a big challenge in Brazil since forever. And for instance, as I mentioned, the public education system in Brazil, it's very underfunded. Our children have a hard time finishing high school, and we should be supporting them more. I guess this is something that is changing in the last decades. We are putting more money on people instead of giving it to firms or big companies. And I think this is quite important because development we should understand as promoting the lives of people. And this is something that Brazil has not learned how to do yet so clearly. So it's making some progress, but we have to move forward in this direction.
The challenges are indeed significant, but as numbers of racial discrimination demonstrates, we have the theoretical foundation to make strong diagnoses and propose solutions. Congratulations on your work, Alysson, and thank you for this enlightening conversation.
Thank you for inviting me, Isabel. It was a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you, my pleasure.
If you like To Be Read and the Explaining Brazil podcast, give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your episodes. Or better yet, subscribe to The Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We run exclusively on subscriptions, so it's your support that keeps us going and growing. You can also sign up to become a member of our Buy Me a Coffee community by going to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report. By joining, you'll get access to exclusive content and a shout out on this podcast. We at the Brazilian Report have been recognised for our quality, winning several international awards. In April 2024, we were named the best news website in the Americas for a small or local newsroom by the World Association of News Publishers, and we won Best Story at the 2024 Digiday Media Awards for our expose on an attempt to hack one of Brazil's Supreme Court justices. And to continue doing this work, we need your support, so go to Brazilian.report. Thanks for listening. To Be Read will be back next month, and Explaining Brazil will be back next week.